The first time Lisa went to the Baker home, she had already been through 4 different foster families. She was 15 and tired of small town kindnesses that soured into cruel rejection. Her last foster mother told her she had too much dark energy, which Lisa found strangely funny. No one else could see what she'd been carrying, and that's why she kept her mouth shut at the Baker's farm, with its high grass that didn't sway in the breeze, and chickens that stopped clucking as she walked by. Lisa wasn't an emotional kid. She'd learned to rein herself in, to keep everything neat and invisible so no one would notice her until she wanted to be noticed. But the Baker house demanded her attention from the moment she arrived. The porch steps seemed to creak even when no one stepped on them, and she felt a chill race over her neck as Mrs. Baker led her inside. Inside, the house was dim and cramped, with low, peeling ceilings and old wallpaper fraying at the seams. The hallway stretched narrow and seemed to shrink as they walked down it, leading her to the room where she'd be staying. "That's Billy's old room," Mrs. Baker said quietly as they entered. There was something about her tone that Lisa didn't like, a strange sadness mixed with irritation. "Who's Billy?" she asked, setting down her bag. Mrs. Baker stiffened, almost imperceptibly. "Billy was my son. He passed away a few years ago." Her lips tightened. "I don't like talking about it." Lisa nodded, but she couldn't help looking around the room, wondering what kind of boy Billy had been. The room had the unsettling feeling of a place recently and reluctantly cleaned. It smelled of stale air, dust, and something faintly metallic that lingered as she unpacked. That night, as she lay in bed, Lisa could swear she heard scratching sounds coming from the closet. She turned on her side, straining her ears, but the noise stopped as soon as she focused on it. She closed her eyes and forced herself to sleep, knowing that she'd probably dream of strange houses and creaky hallways. In the morning, she woke to find her window open, even though she was sure she'd locked it. Cold air drifted in, and she hurried to close it, noticing something strange. On the outside of the window, pressed into the dirt, were 2 small handprints. They looked like they'd been made by a child. The day passed slowly. The Bakers were a quiet couple who rarely spoke to her, spending most of their time in the fields around the house. Lisa wandered the farm aimlessly, keeping her head down and counting down the days until she could be moved again. But as the sun set and she returned to her room, the dread that had been a slow crawl through her day became an intense, unshakable presence. She felt like she was being watched. It was sometime past midnight when she heard it, the scratching, but louder now, coming from directly beneath her bed. Lisa's heart pounded as she slowly rolled over, staring at the edge of the bed, her breath caught in her throat. She gathered her courage and peered over the side, fully expecting to see nothing. But then she saw it. Just a shadow at first, but then, in the dim glow from her bedside lamp, a small hand reached out from under her bed, fingers thin and trembling. She screamed, jumping up and backing against the wall. The hand vanished before Mrs. Baker opened the door, her face a mix of anger and concern. "What is going on, Lisa?" she hissed, her eyes flicking to the bed. There was something under the bed," Lisa stammered. Mrs. Baker's face hardened. "There's nothing under the bed. You're just having a nightmare. Get some sleep." Lisa wanted to argue, but something in Mrs. Baker's eyes made her stop. There was a fear there, a recognition that chilled her. She lay down reluctantly, her eyes darting to the floor, but the hand didn't return. When she finally fell asleep, her dreams were filled with shadowy figures reaching out to her, whispering her name in raspy, childlike voices. The following day, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even outside in the broad daylight. Every time she turned, she thought she caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, something small and quick, but always gone before she could focus on it. That night, she locked her door and lay in bed, clutching her pillow tightly, but the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, insistent, coming from the closet. Her heart hammered as she sat up, the noise seeming to fill her entire world. She knew she should ignore it, should force herself to lie back down, but something compelled her forward. She stood up, took a shaky breath, and walked to the closet. Slowly, she opened the door. Nothing, just empty shelves and a few forgotten boxes. Relief flooded her, but as she turned to go back to bed, the door slammed shut. Lisa jumped, her hand fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, screaming for help, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness around her. And then she heard it, just a whisper at first. Lisa. The voice was soft, childlike, and chillingly familiar. It grew louder, filling the small space with a whisper that seemed to scrape against her skin. Lisa, come play with me. She froze, recognizing the voice now. It sounded like a younger version of herself, but distorted, almost pleading. The whisper grew into a low, scratchy laughter that sent shivers down her spine. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder until it felt like the voice was right next to her ear. The closet door swung open suddenly, and she stumbled out, gasping for air. Mrs. Baker was standing there, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What did you see?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Lisa could only stare, her mind a tangle of fear and confusion. It sounded like me," she whispered. "A little girl," in my voice. Mrs. Baker's face fell. She closed her eyes, muttering something under her breath, and led Lisa back to her room. "This house is old," she said quietly. "Things happened here, things I don't talk about." But Lisa could tell there was more, something Mrs. Baker wasn't saying. She thought about pressing her, about demanding to know who or what was haunting her, but the look in Mrs. Baker's eyes told her it would be useless. She was on her own. That night, the scratching didn't come from the closet or under the bed. It came from inside her own mind, gnawing at her thoughts, twisting her memories. She could hear the voice again, her own voice, younger and softer, asking her to come play, to stay with her forever. The shadows in her room seemed to pulse, coming alive, creeping closer with every breath. And then she saw it, a small figure standing in the doorway, shrouded in darkness, but unmistakably real. It was a girl, about her age, with long, dark hair and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. The girl lifted a hand, beckoning her, a sad smile on her face. "Lisa, come play with me." Lisa tried to scream, but her voice failed her, the darkness pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could feel herself slipping, her vision blurring, her thoughts unraveling as the figure grew closer, filling her vision, pulling her into the shadows. When Mrs. Baker entered the room the next morning, the bed was empty. Lisa was gone, but the window was open, 2 small handprints pressed into the dirt outside. And in the quiet of the house, if one listened closely, there was a faint scratching sound, coming from the closet, echoing through the walls, and mingling with a soft, childlike laughter that would haunt the Baker home forever. The house on Reaper Lane was the sort of place the county didn't talk about. Social workers avoided it, neighbors whispered about it, and the kids who passed by on their way to school gave it a wide berth. But after a long, bleak year of moving from one foster home to another, Adam found himself standing before it. The social worker had barely looked at him before dropping him off, muttering, "Good luck, kid," and leaving him on the cracked stone steps. The house had once been white, but was now a moldy gray-green, its paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The air around it was cold, even though it was the middle of summer, and there was a faint, rancid odor coming from somewhere he couldn't see. Adam swallowed hard and knocked on the door. It creaked open almost immediately, and he found himself looking up at a tall, thin woman with gray skin and eyes that seemed to sink back into her skull. She smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "You must be Adam," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "I'm Mrs. Halverson. Come in, dear." Inside, the house was dim and reeked of something sharp and metallic, like old blood. Adam followed Mrs. Halverson down a narrow hallway filled with dark portraits of people with solemn faces, their eyes following him as he passed. She led him up a creaky staircase to the attic room. It was bare except for a bed with old, stained sheets and a small dresser that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Dinner's at 7, Mrs. Halverson said, her voice thick with something Adam couldn't quite place. "Don't be late." As she left, Adam felt the heavy silence settle around him. The walls seemed to close in, shadows shifting, stretching across the faded wallpaper, and for a moment he thought he heard faint whispering, just outside his door. He tried to ignore it, throwing his things onto the bed and taking out his sketchbook. Drawing was the one thing that kept him grounded, a small slice of control in a life that had been nothing but chaos. But as he sketched, something strange happened. The lines on his paper seemed to move, shifting and curling until they formed a face, a gaunt, hollow-eyed face staring back at him, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. He blinked, but the face didn't disappear. It only grew clearer. He shut the sketchbook and threw it onto the floor, his heart pounding. It's just this place, he told himself. Just the house getting to me. But as he lay in bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night he woke to a low, scraping sound coming from the walls, like nails dragging along the wood. He held his breath, trying to convince himself it was a mouse or maybe the wind. But the scraping grew louder, becoming a faint, raspy voice that whispered his name. Adam, Adam. He covered his ears, squeezing his eyes shut, willing the sound to stop. After a few moments, the house fell silent, and he managed to drift into a restless sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Halverson's breakfast was a cold, grayish porridge that tasted faintly of dirt. Adam forced it down, avoiding her gaze. Her eyes were fixed on him with a strange, hungry look, her thin lips curving into that unsettling smile whenever he glanced up. Days passed in a blurry haze. The whispers in his room grew louder each night, filling his dreams with dark, twisted images. A pale figure with hollow eyes standing at the foot of his bed, shadows seeping from the walls, long, bony fingers reaching for him from the darkness. His drawings took on a life of their own, becoming grotesque, nightmarish scenes of screaming faces and twisted skeletal figures. He didn't remember drawing them, but each morning they were there, waiting for him. One evening, as he was sketching by the dim light of his bedside lamp, he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, his heart racing, but there was nothing there, only the shadows shifting in the corners of the room. But when he looked back at his sketch, the figure he'd been drawing had moved. Its head was tilted to the side now, its dark, hollow eyes staring directly at him. His hand went cold, and he dropped the pencil, watching as the figure's mouth stretched into a smile that seemed to bleed off the page. That night, he was jolted awake by the sound of his door creaking open. His room was pitch black, but he could feel someone, or something, standing just inside the doorway. His breath hitched as he stared into the darkness, paralyzed. The figure stepped forward, its silhouette barely visible, but unmistakably inhuman. It was tall and thin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its face a pale, sunken void with empty sockets where its eyes should have been. It moved closer, its head tilting to the side, studying him with an almost curious expression. Adam tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat. Adam, it rasped, its voice echoing in his mind, filling every corner of his brain. You shouldn't have come here. The thing reached out, its fingers impossibly long, its skin a mottled gray that seemed to absorb the light. Just as it touched his arm, he managed to let out a choked scream, scrambling out of bed and racing down the hallway. He didn't look back, but he could hear its footsteps, slow and deliberate, following him. He burst into the kitchen, expecting to find Mrs. Halverson, but the room was empty. Desperate, he threw open the basement door, hoping to find a way out. But as he ran down the stairs, he stumbled and fell, landing hard on the cold cement floor. The basement was dark and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. As he pushed himself up, he noticed something strange, a pile of old, dusty clothes in the corner, each piece stained and torn. He moved closer, his stomach churning, and realized that they were children's clothes. Some were small, like they belonged to kids younger than him, and others were larger, almost adult-sized. And then he saw them. The bones scattered among the clothes, bleached, white, and brittle, with tiny teeth marks etched into them. A wave of nausea hit him, and he staggered back, his mind reeling. He turned to run, but the basement door slammed shut, trapping him in darkness. The footsteps returned, slow and steady, echoing down the stairs. The creature descended, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its twisted grin stretching wider. Behind it, Mrs. Halverson appeared, her face hollow and expressionless. You should have left when you had the chance, she said, her voice empty of emotion. You're not the first, you know, and you won't be the last. The creature moved closer, its fingers stretching toward him, cold and unyielding. Adam backed into the corner, his heart hammering in his chest as the darkness swallowed him whole. The next day, the social worker returned, finding the house empty. Adam's things were gone, his bed neatly made, as if he'd never been there. Mrs. Halverson greeted her with a thin smile, saying that Adam had run away in the night and that she hoped he'd be found soon. As the social worker left, Mrs. Halverson closed the door behind her, her eyes flicking up to the attic window where a faint shadow stood, watching. And in the basement, The whispers began again, faint and desperate, as if calling out to the world from somewhere beyond. But no one would hear them. No one ever did. Isaac had always been a quiet kid, shuffled through different foster homes since he could remember. The last family, the Jamesons, seemed like a strange but manageable arrangement. They lived way out in the woods where the closest neighbor was miles away, and the only sound was the constant hum of insects and the occasional call of animals. Mrs. Jameson, a stern, thin woman with tired eyes, had made it clear that the family kept to themselves, and if Isaac wanted to stay, he'd better learn to do the same. But the real trouble started on his second night. Isaac had been asleep when a soft, rhythmic creaking pulled him out of his dreams. He lay in the dark, eyes wide, listening. It was a strange, uneven sound, like someone rocking back and forth in an old wooden chair. He sat up, heart pounding, trying to place it. His door was shut tight, but it sounded like it was coming from the attic, just above his room. The next morning, he asked Mrs. Day Jameson about the noise, trying to keep his voice casual. Her face tightened immediately. "We don't go in the attic," she said flatly. Her tone left no room for questions, and Isaac knew better than to ask. He tried to put it out of his mind. But that night, the creaking started again, louder this time, as if someone were dragging something heavy across the floor just above his bed. He lay there, his heart hammering, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But the sound persisted, and with every passing second, it seemed to grow closer, pressing down on him, filling the room with an oppressive weight. The days dragged by, each night bringing more sounds, creaking, whispering, sometimes a faint, sickly laughter that seemed to seep through the walls. Isaac found himself growing more and more exhausted, his mind slipping into a haze of paranoia and fatigue. He noticed things missing, small things at first, like his toothbrush or socks, but then larger things. One morning, he woke to find his shoes gone, replaced by an old pair of cracked leather boots that smelled of mildew. On the sixth night, Isaac couldn't take it anymore. The noises were louder than ever, and he felt something in the room with him, a cold presence that seemed to pulse with every creak and whisper. He got out of bed, his hands shaking, and made his way to the hallway. The house was silent, the shadows thick and heavy, but he could feel something watching him from the dark corners. The attic door loomed at the end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold, and as he turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading up into darkness. He climbed slowly, his breath shallow, his pulse thundering in his ears. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of rot grew stronger, filling his lungs with a sickening sweetness. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a small, cramped attic filled with old furniture and dusty boxes piled haphazardly against the walls. But there was something else there, too. In the center of the attic, sitting in an ancient rocking chair, was a figure. It was shrouded in shadow, but Isaac could make out its shape, a thin, frail body hunched over, its head tilted to one side as if it were studying him. He froze, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body wouldn't move. The figure's head jerked up, and Isaac found himself staring into a pair of hollow, empty eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The figure's mouth stretched into a twisted smile, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. It raised a skeletal hand, beckoning him forward, its movements slow and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Isaac," it rasped, its voice a dry whisper that filled the attic, echoing off the walls. "Come closer." He took a step back, his skin crawling, but the figure's hand shot out impossibly fast, grabbing his wrist with a grip that felt like iron. Its fingers were ice cold, their touch searing his skin with a deep, bone-chilling cold. He tried to pull away, but the figure's grip only tightened, its twisted smile widening as he leaned closer. "Stay," it whispered, its voice filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts. "You'll be my friend, forever." Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, trapping him in the darkness. The figure let out a low, rasping laugh, its hollow eyes filling his vision as it pulled him closer, its grip like iron, unbreakable. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, freezing him from the inside out until he could barely breathe, barely think. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure released him. Isaac stumbled back, gasping for air, his skin prickling with a cold that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. He ran down the stairs, his mind a blur of terror, his heart racing. He burst out of the attic, slamming the door shut behind him, and didn't stop running until he was outside, standing in the dark woods, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Jamesons never found him. By morning, he was miles away, wandering the woods in a daze, unable to remember how he'd gotten there or how long he'd been walking. But he could still feel the cold in his bones, a deep, unshakable chill that followed him wherever he went. Years later, he still dreamed of that night, of the figure in the attic with its hollow eyes and twisted smile, and sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, he could still hear the faint sound of creaking, like an old rocking chair moving back and forth in the darkness, waiting for him to return. Mark had been in foster care for as long as he could remember, drifting from one home to another like a ghost. When he arrived at the Whitfield house, he told himself it would be like all the others, temporary, impersonal, another stop along the way. But there was something about the place that felt different, something unsettling that he couldn't put his finger on. The house was old and massive, towering 3 stories high with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that clung to everything. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield were polite enough, but distant, their eyes always darting around the house as if expecting something to appear at any moment. They had only one rule for Mark: never open the door to the small, locked room at the end of the second-floor hallway. Mrs. Whitfield's face had grown pale as she spoke of it, her voice barely a whisper, her hand gripping his shoulder with a force that startled him. "It's off limits," she had said. "Don't ask about it and don't go near it." The first few days were uneventful. Mark tried to settle in, keeping to himself and avoiding the door on the second floor. But every time he passed it, he felt a strange, prickling sensation, as though something behind it was watching him, waiting for him. The longer he stayed, the stronger the feeling grew, tugging at his curiosity until it was almost unbearable. On the 5th night, he woke to a strange sound, a faint scratching coming from the direction of the locked door. The sound was soft, rhythmic, like fingernails scraping along wood. He pulled the covers over his head, telling himself it was just a mouse, or maybe the wind. But deep down, he knew it was something else. Something. Alive. The next morning, he asked Mrs. Whitfield about the noise, trying to keep his voice steady. She froze, her eyes darting toward the staircase, her face draining of color. "You didn't open it, did you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "No," Mark said quickly. "But what's in there?" Her lips tightened, and she shook her head. "You're better off not knowing. Just stay away, Mark." That night, the scratching was louder, more insistent. It seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, filling his room with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. He tried to ignore it, pressing his pillow over his ears, but the sound only grew louder, now joined by a faint, whispering voice calling his name. Mark. Mark. He lay frozen in his bed, his heart pounding, his skin prickling with fear. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was paralyzed, held in place by the strange, chilling voice. He felt a strange compulsion to get up, to walk down the hall and open the door. The next day, he confronted Mr. Whitfield, demanding to know what was in the locked room. Mr. Whitfield's face grew dark, and he shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "It's none of your business," he said harshly. "Just follow the rules, or we'll have to send you somewhere else." Mark tried to let it go, but the curiosity gnawed at him, an itch that wouldn't go away. That night, as the house fell silent, he crept out of bed and made his way to the hallway. The door seemed to loom larger than before, its dark wood almost pulsing in the dim light. The scratching had stopped, but he could still feel something behind it, waiting for him. Against his better judgment, he reached out and touched the doorknob. It was ice cold, and he felt a strange, pulsing energy radiating from it, as though the door itself were alive. He took a deep breath, and before he could talk himself out of it, twisted the knob. The door swung open, revealing a small, dark room. At first, he thought it was empty, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something huddled in the far corner, a figure, small and frail, with pale, translucent skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It was a girl, no older than 10, her eyes wide and hollow, staring at him with a strange, empty look. Her clothes were tattered, her hair tangled, and her skin was stretched tight over her bones as though she hadn't eaten in weeks. She opened her mouth, and a faint, raspy voice escaped her lips. "Help me." Mark took a step back, his heart racing. He wanted to run, to slam the door and never look back, but something held him in place. The girl's eyes were pleading, desperate, and he felt an overwhelming urge to help her. What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice shaking. "They locked me in here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They said I was sick, said I was dangerous." She held up her hands, and he saw that her fingernails were broken and bloody, the skin around them raw from scratching at the walls. His stomach twisted as he realized she had been trapped here, alone, for who knows how long. "I'll help you," he said, reaching out to her. But as he stepped closer, her expression changed, her eyes growing cold, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "You shouldn't have opened the door," she whispered, her voice changing, growing deeper, more sinister. Her skin began to crack, peeling away to reveal something dark and writhing beneath, something inhuman. Mark stumbled back, his heart pounding as the girl's form began to shift and distort, her limbs stretching, her face twisting into a grotesque, unnatural shape. Her hollow eyes burned with a dark, malevolent light, and she let out a low, guttural growl that filled the room, echoing off the walls. "You let me out," she hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "And now, I'm free." Mark turned and ran, his mind a blur of terror. He stumbled down the hallway, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, the sound of her footsteps following close behind. He could feel her presence behind him, cold and suffocating, filling the air with a sickening, rotting stench. He reached the stairs, his legs shaking, and turned to see her standing at the end of the hallway, her twisted form barely recognizable as human. She smiled, a dark, hungry grin that sent a wave of terror through him. "Thank you, Mark," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. "I've been waiting so long for someone like you." He stumbled down the stairs, his heart racing, and burst out of the front door, not stopping until he was deep in the woods, far from the house. He didn't know how long he ran or where he was going. All he knew was that he had to get away to put as much distance as possible between himself and that thing. The Whitfields never came looking for him. When the social worker found him days later, he was half-starved, his clothes torn, his face pale and haunted. He tried to tell them what had happened, but no one believed him. They chalked it up to trauma, to nightmares, to an overactive imagination. But he knew the truth, and every night, as he lay in his new bed, he could still hear her voice, faint and distant, whispering to him from somewhere in the darkness. "Thank you, Mark. I'll see you soon."